Welcome back to Music of the Year, everyone. For this segment, we have a very special interview with the wonderful maestro behind both Bastion and Transistor, Darren Korb.
Hello.
Darren, thank you for joining us. Also joining us from RPG Fan for the first time, one of my awesome new music editors, Brigid Choi.
Hi, guys.
Brigid, thanks for joining us, too. So basically, for this interview, we're going to focus on Transistor mostly. We have a couple of questions on Bastion and more general musical-type questions, but we'll go right ahead and get into that.
Sweet.
So we'll throw you a softball question for the first one. What video games did you grow up playing? And are you playing any at the moment that you like?
Oh, man. Well, let's see. I started probably on, real early, like my older brothers had a 2600, a Atari 2600 that I played a little bit of, but then I really got into video games. I got a Nintendo, I got an NES and started playing stuff like, Marble Madness and Mario and Bionic Commando and all that stuff when I was a kid, and I love those games. And, have been playing everything all the way up since. And then right now, I'm just moved, so I don't have any of my stuff set up at the moment. So I've been playing some iPad stuff. Like I've been playing a little bit of Hearthstone.
Oh yeah.
Oh
yeah.
man.
Yeah, it's pretty. It's pretty interesting. Like it's a game. Like I don't usually play games that just like consistently make me feel terrible. I try to avoid those, but for some reason I'm making an exception for Hearthstone. I'm not sure why.
It's almost painfully addictive.
Yeah, it's good. Like it's good. I'm enjoying it. Just when I think, oh, well, I've lost like 40 games in a row. There's no way. And then I'll win a few. I'll be like, oh, I'm good all of a sudden, But
I can't quit. I can't quit now. I'm just on the cusp of turning it over.
I know. And so like, I don't know. I'm not playing too much in one chunk. So it's tolerable. Yeah. Anyway, I'm enjoying that. I played, I've been playing Valkyria Chronicles
Nice.
a little bit on PC. I picked it up a couple of months ago. That's pretty cool. I'm really enjoying that. And then I'm like a few chapters into that. And then I picked up so many games in the Steam Winter Sale, and I'm excited to play them, but I have no idea when I will ever have time to play all of the games that I have now.
Yeah, it's that endless backlog, especially when the Steam sales come up, and I guess the point now where I'm like, yeah, I guess I could buy this and play it in 2 years.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, at some point, we'll see. I'm hoping after I get settled from my move, like I'll have time, like I can set aside some time to play some video games every, once in a while. That'd be good.
Yeah, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so just gonna jump right into Bastion, I think. Or actually just like your musical background. I'd read that online that you had written music for like films or something other like before video games, and I'm just wondering if you like ever thought that you were going to work on video games, or ever had like interest in working on video games before you worked on Bastion.
Yeah, well, the stuff that I did for film and TV stuff, projects were just really small little projects that people I knew were doing and sort of asked me to work on, or I was able to make a piece or two here and there. I certainly wasn't doing it like professionally in terms of, making a living doing it or anything. But I was just, my aim was sort of just to do some job where I got to make music. And I didn't, I was working in a recording studio or interning specifically in a recording studio and, doing some little producing jobs here and there. And I was like doing hired musician kind of gigs in New York at that time. And I was just taking whatever opportunity presented itself to me, basically involving music. And my buddy who I'd grown up with, Amir Rao, who, we'd played games, we've been playing D&D together since we were like 8 years old. and I would like sleep over at his house and like watch him play Shining Force 2 and whatever. Like,
oh my gosh, you're singing to my heart right now.
Yeah, man, it was good. That was really good. But like, anyway, so we had been in bands together for years and stuff and done creative stuff together, and we went to school together when we were kids. He was co-founding this company when I was, doing that in Brooklyn, trying to take whatever music gig, and he asked me to do all of the audio and sound, the music and sound for the company. And I, of course, was like, yeah, I'll totally do that. Before that, I didn't know, like, I love video games and I've loved them forever, but I just didn't know that it was a job you could have to like make music for video games. Like I had no idea that was a career path at all.
Yeah.
So I, as far as like whether or not I had an ambition to do it, no, but like it's the perfect thing for me though, like
Yeah.
that I never knew I wanted to do it, but it's totally what I wanted to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's sort of one of those things. Like I study Japanese, and sort of like for me, it's like you end up in these opportunities that like are this confluence of all your passions, and you don't even realize how it happened. But then you're like, oh yeah, this fits perfectly.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome. So in Bastion, you have a lot of like Middle Eastern and Eastern instruments that sort of flit in and out of the songs, and you don't have to me at least. And again, I'm sort of a newbie here when it comes to musical terminology. I defer to Brigid and you on that one. It seems like you don't hear as much of that in Transistor. Was there like a stylistic decision you made when you did that, or how did you sort of differ Bastion and Transistor's music? Like how did you approach them and what mindset and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, the whole goal behind the musical palette stuff and what instruments were in there and not in there was really just to try and help, with the world building basically, and try and help create the place that the game was in, and to further assist in immersing the player in that world. So, the kind of for Bastion, Caelondia, we wanted it to have sort of a Byzantine Empire, a little bit sort of vibe, if that makes sense. So that's where a lot of that Middle Eastern kind of influence comes from instrumentally is the fact that, we wanted it to have a little bit of that kind of feel mixed in there, at least for the earlier pieces in the game where you're in the city. So that's really where that comes from. And then the lack of that in Transistor is dictated basically by the same thing, which is just that it's a different setting that would feel out of place in, and for Transistor, I definitely looked at some more kind of European, like almost like some gypsy kind of instruments and old world, more European classical instruments and stuff like that. And then I wanted to butt that up against, digital, electronic, distorted, stuff, to help, achieve the feeling that we were going for.
That's really interesting that you say you go for like old world European stuff, because when I hear it, all I hear is like trip hop and post rock and all these very new things. So
sure, yeah. Well, as far as the palette of instruments, though, I use a lot of harp, I use a lot of accordion.
Oh yeah.
I use mandolin, I use a lot of things like that in the Transistor soundtrack. So it's the style of music isn't necessarily reflective of those things, but the instrument choices, as an ingredient in there.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so when you go back and listen to the music of Transistor, is there anything that you would change?
I feel like I've gotten, it's one of the hardest things about making anything creative is like saying, okay, that's done,
Yeah.
So
it's never done.
I feel like I've gotten pretty decent at just like being content with my finished pieces, calling them finished and being content. Like I don't, I do the best I can with it, and then I like leave it, and I try to do that,
Cool.
As much as possible. So yeah, I don't really have like, oh man, I wish I could go back and like, mix that snare a little bit louder or whatever. I don't. I'm like, well, that's what sounded good to me when I was mixing it, and I'll stick with that.
This is how it's in the world. This is how I want it.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of my feeling. I don't want to do any revisionist George Lucas style. No, I wasn't. I didn't do it right the first time.
This song actually should have had Jar Jar Binks talking in it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Gosh.
Yeah, exactly.
So I gave Brigid all the hard questions, and all mine are the softball ones. So here's a softball question for you. So among Bastion and Transistor, do you have some favorite pieces in either of those? And if so, why? Like, what about them? Like a song that you especially love that you finished and you're like, oh man, this is awesome.
Or like I think part of a song too.
Say again?
Like if you really like the instrumentation that you did, or like the effects.
Like a specific thing about a song. Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for Bastion, I would say the song that I was most relieved and satisfied to finish was Setting Sail Coming Home, probably, because it was the one that I had thought about the longest and kind of didn't know whether or not I'd be able to execute just because I hadn't really done anything exactly like that before, and I had the concept to write these two songs that were connected, that you could put together and have that kind of polyphonic thing happening. So that was the so all of that, actually, that song, the music for it is based on the music I made for the first Bastion trailer, which came out like well before I ended up writing Setting Sail Coming Home. So I wrote that, and then I wrote Zia's song based on the music for that, with the intention of writing another song later that I would then combine with it and then put over this music. So, and then I wrote the Zolf's theme and much later, and then had to modify them a little bit to combine them. And when I was able to do that, I was really relieved and satisfied with how that turned out. So that was a fun one for me on Bastion for sure, and definitely like I breathed a big sigh of relief when I finished it. For Transistor, I would say Old Friends was a piece that I was really glad when I did it, because our process on Transistor was a little bit different than on Bastion. We spent like a really long time just everybody was sort of prototyping their own discipline a little bit before we went ahead and started making a game. And putting it all together, which is very different from Bastion, where we're just like, it's all in the game always, like everything, like everything you make goes in the game right away. So I was spinning my wheels for a while before I felt like I really found the tone I was going for on the music for Transistor. Mm-hmm. I'd made probably like 7 pieces or something before I made Old Friends, and was like, oh, that's the tone.
That's cool.
Yeah, Old Friends is like whenever I show people the Transistor OST, and like I just link them Old Friends, because it's just a good like one that defines the game and the music of the game.
Awesome. That feels great to hear, because that's really like I felt that way for me from a creative standpoint, as that was my center, and I could stick a pin in the map, and and as long as it was related to that somehow, it would maybe fit on the
yeah,
the rest of the music. And then let's see, I also really was glad to finish so I was really happy to do Signals, which doesn't actually appear in the game, it's just on the soundtrack.
Yeah,
but that one was really fun for me to do because it was so fast. I did it like really, really quickly. I wrote it, Ashley came over, we recorded it live. Like I was in the room with her with my guitar, and that's the only one we did that way.
That's really cool.
It's like free time,
Yeah.
It's not to a tempo.
Yeah, you're right. Oh my gosh.
So we had to kind of be in the room with each other to do that, to be able to track that way. So that was really fun, and it was just like a very different kind of refreshing approach. Ashley did like 2 or 3 takes of the vocal or something. It's just and I did like some minor comps, like. I did almost nothing at all, and I did very, very little on that one to make, to like get the performance, because Ashley just killed it. And then, so I was really pleased with how that one turned out, especially given like how easily it came. Cause some of them, you do like 100 takes and you like, it's not right. It's not, beating yourself up and whatever. And that one was like the opposite, of that. So that was really satisfying.
Is there just like no space to put signals on the game? Like no like place right?
No,
place
I mean I wrote it after the game was done.
Okay.
For the soundtrack exclusively.
Oh right.
Because I knew we wanted like an extra something on the soundtrack that wasn't in the game, because we had done that for Bastion and with the Pantheon. And
See, I really like that. We talk. So this interview is actually part of our Music of the Year celebration. So where we're like celebrating stuff, where we've mentioned Transistor several times already, and we talk a lot about like how the appreciation of game audio has really blossomed in the last couple of years. Nowadays, you have the soundtracks being released with games, and you have a lot more emphasis on it. I think there's, in general, a lot of people realize that people really like this kind of music, and so I love that you all are doing that. Where it's like specifically for the soundtrack release. We want this on the soundtrack release, and it's in the style of Transistor, but that it's on there. I really like that.
Absolutely, yeah. That was important to us to do, and we feel like with a game about a singer, who has this catalog. I mean, I just approach everything like all the songs that she sings are just songs that she's written, that Red has written from her catalog.
Yeah.
And same with Signals as well. So I just sort of approach it the same way, and lyrically that one was fun for me to do, because it was just like, I don't know, somehow it represented a little bit of closure for me working on Transistor and stuff, and which I had been working on for a really long time. So yeah, that was fun.
That is really cool. I actually reviewed Transistor, and like one of the things that I think y'all do really well, and forgive me for spinning your wheels a little here, but I feel like especially in Transistor, I like Bastion, but in Transistor, there's a serious evidence that like the aesthetics of that game were all designed together. Like I feel like the music and the visuals, narrative, and the way you talk about that song and like this process, it really seems to me as though like everything is so tied together. And that was something I really noted when I was playing it too. It's like everything sort of ties together so well. And I really love it when, in particular, the music, being a giant music geek, the music can really like hook into the game and feel like part of the experience and not just a backdrop.
That's great. I mean, yeah, that's great to hear too, because we definitely emphasize that in our development process for sure. I mean, that was something that was important to us. We want, it is all connected for us, and having it all speak to, each other discipline, having the art and music and story and writing and everything interact is really important. And the design interact is important to us for sure, because that's part of creating this immersive place and building a world that people, that you're trying to create for people and immerse them in.
That feels tangible.
That's all. I think that's all pretty important stuff, like all the details and how everything connects.
Well, at least for me, you nailed it. So good work.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, we actually had a question about that later, and so you already answered it. Like,
okay.
I stole it. I'm sorry. That's okay.
No, it's fine. Yeah, because I've run into, when I tell people like I want to be a video game music composer, and when sometimes the reaction is like, oh, but that's just, the music is just in the background. Like, what are you gonna do about that? And like when I give people samples, they're like, well, how do you make samples for music like when to a game that's not developed yet? And so it's just really inspiring and encouraging to hear you say that.
Oh, for sure. I mean, yeah, I definitely think music can be, it can be used either way. I mean, it can be used. I think a lot of times it is relegated to sort of background music, or it's not part of the development process. And I think that's more common probably, but I think it's definitely possible to make it just as important to the game's aesthetic as the art that you see and the story that happens when you play.
Yeah, I think you could compare it to like films too. There are art films that are made, where everything has to hook in together. And then not to disparage Hollywood films, but you have like a Hollywood film where, we put the movie together and then we hired a guy to write music for it. And it could be great music, but it might not necessarily be a priority when they're, thinking of how this is going to work aesthetically.
Sure, yeah.
So, we've been talking about Transistor a lot, and I was thinking that, so Supergiant Games is like pretty big in the indie game world, and like I'd feel comfortable saying it's like a pioneer or a leader in the indie game world. And I'm just wondering, if you would ever think about working for a bigger game company like EA or Square Enix or something, or if you're like
personally, or Supergiant as a company, or
I think like you personally, like musically, like, write a soundtrack for, for like a big publisher.
I work at Supergiant full time. Like, it's my gig. So like, I don't really do contract stuff, which that stuff generally is.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So, if some perfect opportunity came up and I, was able to get permission from everybody at Supergiant or whatever, and I could do something on the side, maybe I would, but the idea of working for like a big publisher where, the relationship would be really, really different.
Yeah, definitely.
Supergiant, and it would be more similar, I think, to like a more standard kind of client relationship where they want me to do something specific and I give them that,
like I'll fax you the invoice type thing.
Yeah, or just, what I mean is they say, I had this experience when I was doing stuff like little TV film kind of projects where like a couple of commercial gigs that I worked on where they'd be like, well, we want to use this Coldplay song, but it's really expensive. So can you make one that's sort of like this Coldplay song that we like already? And that's in my experience, like when you work with, somebody who's just hiring you, it's kind of more like that, where they're like, we have this temp music we're already using. Just make a thing that's legally different from this temp music, but is very similar.
Yeah.
So the idea of that isn't super appealing to me. And also, I've got like an awesome gig at the moment, or, indefinitely as far as forever, I hope, So yeah, I don't have any ambition to do that necessarily.
That's usually a good sign, though. You're happy,
Yeah, absolutely.
So sort of on a similar but not quite the same note, Brigid had mentioned to me that she read that you would love to write music for Fallout, the Fallout series.
Well, I mean, somebody asked me if there was something you would, be interested in. I think the context of that was somebody asked me, like, if you had to pick another thing to write music for, what would it be? And yeah, maybe Fallout, because just because that series is, especially Fallout 2 was like a super important game to me.
Oh man.
And I played
so good.
I played that game probably like twice a year for like, 12 years or something. Like start to finish. And it's like a 40-hour game. It's not like a little...
Yeah, it's an investment.
So I play that game like every possible way with all the different, like the guy who can't fight but has 10 intelligence, and the guy who, like, all the everything.
Oh my gosh.
All the, like, the super unlucky guy and the whatever, all the different ways you can play that, and like all the different choices. There's so many choices. It's such a huge game. And just like, I played it, maybe 2 years ago, and discovered like new stuff I had never even seen before in that game. It's crazy. Anyway, that game's awesome. But at the same time, like I picked that Fallout series because I love that game so much, but Mark Morgan's music is part of the reason I love that game so much. So like, I don't really want to, he's around still. He should do it,
Yeah. Well, I don't know that he did Fallout 3 and New Vegas. I don't think he did.
Yeah, I don't think he did.
And I was really bummed out about that.
Yeah, I wasn't, those games are cool, but they're not as much in my wheelhouse as, in terms of stuff I like, as the like isometric turn-based, combat. Like, that's my jam.
Oh man, stop saying things I agree with. Like in undergrad, I think I played Fallout 1 and 2 like 4 or 5 times, like once a year. Like,
Yep.
So I'm so glad to hear that.
Oh yeah, those games are spectacular, and I'd never played anything like them when they came out, in terms of like a game that was so successful tonally, and just like it had a really cool tone where it was like super bleak but also super charming and funny at times.
Yeah,
really,
the humor is so hard to pull off like that.
It's really hard, and they somehow did it. And like all of these amazing moments that I remember from that game mostly happened in that like crappy little green text box, like.
Yep.
Just like me reading stuff is like all the amazing stuff that happens. It's like so cool. Yeah. Anyway, the Fallout 3 and New Vegas were cool, but I just like can't enjoy like a first person open world Fallout as much as I can enjoy the other type of game.
It's a very different style, I think. So I guess sort of not on that note, but if you could collaboratively, if there were, is there like another composer or, involved in games, or just, a film composer, a rock band, anything in particular, would you like your dream collaboration if there were nothing in the way of it? Like if you could say Supergiant's next game, they were like, we have $1 billion. You can hire anybody you want to work with them.
I guess like a dream collaboration. Let me think. I don't know. Like part of me wants to say somebody like, Johnny Greenwood or something, because I love his music. Obviously in Radiohead, he's like a big part of the texture of that band, which is awesome. And his music that he's done for movies and like the P.T. Anderson movies is super, super cool, especially There Will Be Blood. That music is amazing. So yeah, he'd be really incredible to work with, I imagine. I don't know, but in my fantasy, I guess. And almost like somebody like who I just admire a ton, like Dave Grohl or something, would be cool.
Yeah.
Like just because he's just like so talented in so many ways.
If
Um,
I'm not mistaken, didn't Dave Grohl do? I think he's in the Foo Fighters. So didn't he do the first album like entirely himself?
oh
Like
yeah, yeah,
he performed every instrument.
yeah,
Oh man, yeah. Would
and
that
he
I
did
had
it in
that
a week.
talent.
He did it in a week.
Oh, good.
Yeah, it's songs that he'd been like writing while he was in Nirvana and had written, and then he just like rented his, a little studio and did a mixed, demo tape or whatever, and then that became an album that like did really well. Yeah,
Yep.
man, talented guy. And as far as like other composers working in games, like I've been chatting with Austin Wintory a while now, and he's a guy who like works like totally opposite of how I work, and so I think it would be really fascinating to collaborate with somebody like him.
Yeah, like really interesting creative process.
Yeah, because he's a guy who his instrument is like is the orchestra, and he writes for other people. Like he doesn't play anything himself. He's a conductor. Like that's his instrument,
Yeah.
And I don't do that at all. I don't write sheet music. I can maybe read it if I sit there for an hour, so like
all cows eat grass.
That is not my, yeah, that is not my, my area of expertise. And so that would be like a fun process for me probably to collaborate with somebody like that.
Very cool.
Like in I took an orchestration class, and you have to think like we were taught to think about like, can the singer actually sing this?
Yes.
And are these notes like comfortable enough for the cellist to play?
Yeah. Can the cellist play these notes? Should they be on the viola or whatever? Should they be on the violin? Yeah.
And then when I move over to my own music, then I'm like, wait, a computer's going to play this. I can do whatever I want. And yeah, it's really different.
Yeah. I mean, I guess in some regard, I've had to think about that a little bit. Like I've written a lot of songs with Ashley's voice.
Yeah.
And so, I've had to write with her in mind and her range and everything. And what'll happen usually is I'll write the song and I'll try to write it in her range, but sometimes it'll be more in my range, and then she'll get there and it'll be too low and we'll transpose it. It's not,
that's pretty
not the end of the world, so let's take it up a few steps. But yeah, I'm getting a little better for feeling out her vocal range when I'm writing.
Cool. So I've mentioned that I want to be a video game music composer. I'm just wondering, like, if you have any advice for me or for other aspiring game composers, and like anything you'd recommend, or the ways of thinking or doing stuff.
Yeah, I mean, for me, something I think that was the most helpful was my understanding, like, of my ability to produce music as a producer and engineer. I think that's probably the most helpful for the kind of music I make.
Okay.
Meaning getting good with a piece of audio software, being able to do a good sounding mix, get your idea from your head to people's ears, as accurately as you can in terms of how you want it to sound. That is like a really, really valuable skill, I think. And that's something that's really helped me, do what I do. Somebody like Austin Wintory, that doesn't matter for him because he doesn't do that. He does a different thing, so it's different depending on what you want to do, obviously. And, but for me, a guy who plays everything, and I work by myself basically, except for Ashley, that's, I think, a valuable part of my process, and something that, if that is a route you want to go, that was really helpful for me. I interned in a recording studio for a while. And that was really valuable for me for a lot of reasons. I think partially because you pick up some engineering tips every once in a while and learn how people record different instruments and get mixing tips and things like that. But really mostly the most helpful thing about that for me was learning that I didn't need a studio to do what I do. Because I would do projects at home, and then, I would hear stuff recorded in the studio, and, the stuff I did at home, I thought sounded better a lot of the time because I was able to dedicate the time and effort and focus on the stuff I did at home, whereas in the studio you're on the clock, all the time.
Yeah, like every hour costs.
Yeah. So, if in a vacuum, right, cost and time weren't a factor, and you could spend the same amount of time in a studio working on something as you could at home at your laptop or whatever, then maybe the studio could yield better results. Like the potential is higher, maybe, because you have access to a bunch of fancy gear and whatever and microphones. But if you're able to just, you know, if you got to choose, I would pick time almost every time, as long as you have like halfway decent gear and are, you know, a command of some audio software. I think that's really, really valuable.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks.
Very interesting.
Yeah, no problem. And I would add that, you know, one of the reasons that's so valuable is because, especially in games, independent games, where maybe the budget is smaller or something, you can't hire, you know, necessarily afford to hire people. So getting your music to sound good with, you know, as few middlemen as possible.
Yeah,
you know,
as much control as you can have, and as you know, few people you can afford to pay.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really that was really why one of my big influences in making the music for Bastion was just, how can I do this all by myself? What instruments can I use that are going to sound good just for me doing this by myself, you know? And so I tried to avoid strings unless they were string loops or something that were real strings that were recorded, or if I did use fake strings, I would like process them really heavily so you couldn't tell that they were like a bad fake string sample, and it just sounded like, you know, so I would take it, if I was going to use a bad sound, I would process it in a way that made it sound intentional and not just like some dumb cheesy string sample, if that makes sense.
It's kind of like, there's also like that old maxim of like, you know, creative constraints are what produce some of the best creative work. You know,
Absolutely.
Like, you know, if you have access to perfect instruments all of the time and live performers, it's not that you're going to perform something bad, but, you know, you might not put as much time or, you know, think creatively, like you said, where you're processing the string sound a lot to get an interesting or unique sound.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I, you know, for example, you know, I took some poetry classes in school, for fun, basically. And I always found that it was harder to just write a poem with no form than it was to write a sonnet or something, which has like a pretty strict, challenging form.
Yeah.
But the form is what forces you to choose, to make choices, you know? It's what forces you to make creative choices. Whereas when you don't have to make any choices, it's really hard to make something.
Yeah, and like musically too, it's really interesting because like, you know, you look at like old like Super Nintendo music or like Sega Genesis music where they had like specific sound hardware that they could work with. Yeah. It was like, you know, you only had like 4 channels I think on the NES to make music, and so it's like, well, I better make the melody most of this. So I think, you know, people are always like, oh, old NES music has such memorable melodies. It's like, well, that's because that's all we had.
Yeah, they couldn't do chords. You know, they could do like a little bit maybe, but not.
Yeah, definitely. So for our last question, and I am almost certain that you can't say anything, is Supergiant working on something right now? Do you have a project that you know, if obviously I'm sure you can't say anything about that, but you know, do you have ideas floating around for a new project?
Yeah, you know, we're still kind of tying up some Transistor loose ends at the moment, and just doing some ancillary stuff with that. And we're just, you know, thinking about what's going to come next. It's kind of too early to say, honestly.
Yeah, well.
But yeah, we will definitely be sticking together as a team and making more stuff. That I can say.
Awesome. Well, great. Well, Darren, thank you so much for taking your time on Friday morning to hang out with us and chat with us. It was really interesting to talk to you again.
No problem.
Thanks so much.